Hello there, I am the Magic Skeptic, aka Magic Dara. What you're about to watch is a clip from a larger episode that's linked in the description below. So if you enjoy this clip, make sure you check out the full episode. I hope you enjoy the video.
We had a life and death crisis involving my toddler daughter, who one evening when my spouse and I were downstairs, came upstairs, and there must have been something on the top of the chest of drawers because what she did was pull out the drawers and start to use them as a stairway
Oh no.
to get to the top of the chest of drawers. Okay. So we didn't realize she was up there, and then we heard this enormous crash. And both of us knew that something really bad had happened. And my wife rushed up before I did. But in running up the stairs, I had the feeling that, well, it was a frozen in time sense that whatever I was going to find at the top of the stairs and in the bedroom was going to be life changing. And the scene that greeted us was horrifying because the chest of drawers had fallen completely on my child.
Oh my God, Brian.
And we didn't hear anything underneath it. And my wife was struggling to push it up. And as she was pulling it up, the drawers were falling on the kid,
Oh,
etc., etc.
Jesus
Oh,
Christ
yes.
above.
Let me tell you, this was just horrifying. What are we going to be greeted with when we finally pull the damn chest of drawers and put it back up with all the drawers shut, etc.? And for me, the incredible thing about it, and I know my first spouse shared this view, was that our child suffered no injuries at all.
Wow.
And that just lit a fire in my brain. And I said to myself, how is it possible? What machination of physics would derive that income or drive that outcome? What would drive that as a possible outcome to a child having a complete chest of drawers fall on them? And I had a real problem trying to figure that out. I could not rationalize it, although obviously, from a scientific perspective, that's exactly what happened. The thing fell on her, and she might have had the slightest bruise or slightest cut abrasion on her skin on one of her wrists, but that was it. And both of us were shaken to the core about it. And that bothered me for quite a period of time. And one evening, I had the New Testament. I had the book on the book on the bed, the lampshade next to the lamp table next to the bed, and I just sat there and I looked at the chest of drawers, and I know this sounds wild, but I'll simply say what happened, and I'll also compare this to something else that I heard someone else say. I actually heard this voice saying, what else do I need to show you to convince you that I'm real and that you should believe in me? And I didn't really have an answer to that. I mean, I can give you an answer now, but at the time I felt I don't have an answer to this. I have to, in a sense, follow the voice or give the voice some credence because what happened appears to be a miracle, even if there is a scientific explanation for it. And again, that's the kind of circumstance. Consider your own emotional reaction to what I told you that we saw. Good heavens. Uh, who could imagine a positive outcome from that? I mean, the, what we got as a result was now you know not to do that again, don't you? That was the sum total of the response. So I did start to quote believe again unquote, and went to mass with a lot more certainty until over the passage of time, the whole experience faded away. But it also was still kind of a nagging incident that pricked the mind. And would pull me up short occasionally. I'm not proselytizing about my experience. I'm simply putting it out there and saying this
Sure.
happened. This happened to me, and 40 years later, and with in the light of all my subsequent experience, I still don't know quite how to account for that voice.
Sure.
And I'd be interested in your take on it. Actually.
Yeah, well, there's lots to say, and can I just say, by the way, you keep making the point that you're not proselytizing, which is wonderful, but please don't feel the need to keep reasserting that. Your sincerity is not in doubt here.
Right.
It's evident. Okay. It's evident, and I mean, in the podcasts that have already gone live, it's evident in the comments that you are viewed by my listeners the same way I view you, as a sincere, kind gentleman. So please don't feel the need to clarify that you're not proselytizing. I know you are merely relaying the experiences you've had in an honest fashion, and your goal here isn't to convert anyone. You're not even you don't even hold the conviction that it's necessarily true yourself. You're simply just explaining things that have happened to you, and thank you for sharing your experiences. Can I just say as well, a specific thank you for sharing that rather traumatic story about your daughter. That sounds like it was hell, and that sounds like, I mean, that's just any parent's nightmare, right? And while
Absolutely.
And while I am not myself a parent, there was a lump in my throat while I was listening to you tell that story. And again, just thank you for sharing that with me. And I want to set the stage that way because obviously I'm in the rather unenviable position here where I am now about to, for lack of a better phrase, kind of tear that down and explain why I don't believe anything supernatural was going on there. And so I just want to set the stage in that way because I don't want you, Brian, or the listener at the very least, to view what I'm about to say as callous or as unfriendly. This conversation between Brian and I think you'll agree with this, Brian. There's a lot of good faith between us. Would you agree with that?
No question. Let me interject before, though, that, and I'm not trying to take some of your steam away here.
No, please be my guest.
Right. When I look back on it, you'll remember how I described the epiphany that I had regarding Stoicism and it having been a function of the things I was reading at the time and the simple atmosphere that I was in.
Sure.
In many ways, I think of my reconversion to Catholicism in the same way. It was a function of what I was doing at the time, the reading that I had done, some exposure to the miracle narratives in the Bible, or rather in the New Testament, and a profound emotional reaction to something that, from a factual and scientific matter, sounds unbelievable, even if it happened.
Sure.
And I'd simply say that part of my nagging and mentally being knifed or pricked occasionally is still trying to make sense of that incident in my own head.
Yeah, and, sure.
If you want that, and I think I've given you a platform. I've given you a cutting board, so go at it.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I'm not trying to be negative there. I mean, I'm genuinely interested in hearing what your analysis of that is, recognizing that neither of us are psychologists, but both of us are, I think, for these purposes, kind of lay practitioners, although you probably have more training than I because you've studied comparative religions and so have a deeper well to dip into.
Well, I will not pretend at all to be an expert in psychology or anything of the like. As you said yourself, I do have a specialism in comparative religions. And so I'm going to use what I know to, again, take on this unenviable task of explaining why that story, as beautiful as it was, and as beautiful as your interpretation of it is, again, I do have this unenviable task of now, again, for lack of a better phrase, I have this unenviable task of tearing it down. And so to that end, I just wanted to clarify that what I'm about to say is not said with any degree of callousness or cold-heartedness. I'm just going to explain what I think went on to the best of my ability from my atheistic perspective. And so with that acknowledged, I'll dive right in. So one of the first things that shines through in the story, it seems to be a huge component of the miraculous nature of this, or so-called miraculous nature of this narrative for you, is the fact that your daughter was uninjured or relatively uninjured, right?
Correct.
And the first thing that pops into my mind when you say that is, what about all of the other children on planet Earth who, when exposed to the same scenario, were not so fortunate? And forgive me for describing it so bluntly, but the children whose skulls were crushed when the wardrobe fell on them. What about those children? What about the children who weren't, quote, lucky? Right? That's the first thing that comes to mind whenever somebody tells me of a miraculous tale where somebody, quote, survived when they shouldn't have, end quote. And so that's a huge problem. And it seems to me, when I import that thinking into this narrative, it's much more likely to me that your child survived because your child was lucky. I see no reason to suppose, and again, you're not an active believer yourself, so please don't see anything I'm saying here as me lecturing you. A lot of what I'm saying here is more or less for the benefit of the listener. But when I think of that story and how your child was uninjured or relatively uninjured by the end, what about all those other children who weren't so lucky? I mean, it's cold comfort for those parents to be told, oh, well, we were delivered of this horrendous incident by the divine plan, but, you weren't. I've mentioned the story of Julian Kopka in the past, where she was the one survivor in a flight of 92 people. 91 other people perished. She survived the plane crash into the Amazonian jungle and rainforest, and she survived a further 9-day hike to survival and lived to tell the tale. Religious people view that story as a miracle, and they say, oh, isn't it wonderful that God saved her? But is God playing favorites? Why didn't God save the other 91 people? So the fact that that's the way it is seems to me to indicate that there is no divine plan or agency involved, and that when a child does emerge unscathed, as it were, that leans much more in the direction of luck than it does a divine plan. And, you said, I don't know how this happened. And in my view, this is the other problem with human psychology. So to take the UFO analogy, right? So you get a bunch of people standing on the sidewalk and an unexplained flying object passes overhead. And they say, oh my God, look at that. And it appears to move in a manner that is not conducive to a standard human-created aircraft. And they say, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. It's literally an unidentified flying object. And then one of the people inevitably concludes, it must be aliens. Well, no, unfortunately, you don't get to conclude that it must be aliens. The conversation ends when you say, I don't know what it is. But because human beings are so curious, we're curious to a fault. Because we're so curious and we're so desirous of an explanation for unexplained phenomena, we're so desirous of that we will insert a bad explanation rather than just accepting that we don't know. And so the fact that a child survives a chest of drawers falling on them is not very persuasive to me as a kind of example that would seek to demonstrate the existence of a divine plan or a divine entity. But I can go even further here. You said that you couldn't figure it out. And that to me is directly analogous to the people who see the unexplained flying object. You're saying, I don't know how this happened. I don't know how my child survived. That to me is the end of the conversation. You just don't know, and that's the end of it. The place where this gets really tricky is when you say that after this supposed miracle that you heard a voice. Was this the following day? Was it the following week? The time scale isn't necessarily relevant. I just want to get a sense of the story. Was it the following evening or what have you?
I would say it was maybe two days or so afterwards.
Okay.
So it was a buzz with trying to cope with what I had seen.
Sure. So 2 days later, you have this, and now this is a de facto religious experience. You hear a voice that says essentially, what else do I have to do to prove to you that I exist. And that is rather perplexing. Now, again, coming back to my opening statement here, I trust you fully and totally. I believe what you're telling me when you say that you had that experience. But this is where my old friend Hume comes into play. And so there is a difference, needless to say, between being mistaken and lying, right? I don't think you're lying to me at all. I think what you're telling me is the truth. You're telling me to the best of your ability, you're relaying to me and explaining to me what happened to the best of your ability. And you heard a voice that said, what else do I have to do to convince you of my existence?
Yes, let me just interject that the voice was in my head, wasn't in my ears.
Okay, great. So it was a psychological experience more so than a sensorial one.
Yeah, it was a thought that I did not want, that I did not expect to have, or that it's mystical, for want of a better word.
Sure.
It's a surprising response of your mind to the events that occurred that appears to have an external source.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, I take your word for it. And my response would be that even if every single person who has had a religious experience believed it completely and totally, let's assume that there are no liars among the bunch. And look, I think both you and I would accept that there are, unfortunately, people who are disingenuous and do this for attention seeking and so forth. But
right.
even if every single person who has heard a voice internally was telling the truth, and that they believe that voice was in fact God, that would not prove that God is actually the right explanation for such an experience. I'll use my own mother as an example, right? I trust my mother so intrinsically that words fail to explain how much I trust her, right? How will I follow that up?
You almost don't have to.
I almost don't have to. That's a great point, right? I trust her so totally and fully that I would trust her with my life, right? Even in the case of my mother, if my mother told me that she had breakfast with Jesus this morning, let's imagine she had a corporal vision where an actual entity manifested in a physical form, I'd actually believe her if indeed she told me such a thing. But I'd also believe simultaneously that she's mistaken. You see, those two are not mutually exclusive. You can be telling the truth and also be mistaken. I would be wondering whether or not she was hallucinating. I would be wondering whether or not a guy just simply dressed up as Jesus and fooled her, etc., right? So the probability that the witness is lying or mistaken, and this is to quote Hume directly, the probability that the witness is either lying or mistaken is almost always higher than the probability that an actual religious experience has occurred. So Hume said, and I quote, "Therefore, we may establish as a maxim that no human testimony can have such force as to prove a miracle and make it a just foundation for any system of religion." So when I think about your voice in your head, again, I believe you totally and fully. I just think that it's possible that you're mistaken. Now, it's also possible that you're not mistaken, and that an actual literally existing God communicated with you. But the problem is this: the voice you heard would not be enough to verify that fact. Because the problem is, how do we differentiate between you, who has heard a voice from a literally existing God, and another person who has heard a voice that's just a hallucination? How do we differentiate between those two people? And there doesn't appear to be a satisfactory answer to that. Because even if it's true, as I say, even if it's true that you are actually spoken to by a literally existing God, there is no mechanism, scientific or otherwise, that we can use to differentiate between your experience and the experience of somebody who may, for example, have been suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy, which is a very well understood phenomenon. People who suffer from temporal lobe epilepsy are sometimes prone to having religious visions and, as you put it, mystical experiences. Some have gone so far in the study of comparative religions to suggest that even St. Paul himself may have been suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy. Paul himself, in his own writings, refers to a, quote, thorn in the flesh that he's suffering from. That comes from 2 Corinthians 12:7.
I remember the phrase. Yes.
Sure. And some have referred to this passage to say that Paul here may have, in fact, been admitting to something that is consistent with our understanding of temporal lobe epilepsy, and Paul's Damascus Road experience may have, in fact, been nothing more than a human being who was suffering from a diagnosable psychological condition. And I'm not suggesting for a moment, by the way, Brian, that you're suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy. I'm just pointing out that I don't know, actually, why or how a voice was heard in your head. I don't know the answer. But the thing is, neither do you. And coming full circle back to my original point, if we don't know why or how something happened, that is, however unsatisfactory it might be for us as curious human beings, that is the end of the conversation. We cannot say any more about it.
Because we get into the realm of magical thinking.
We get into the realm of magical thinking, but we also get into the realm of fallacious thinking. And I'm referring specifically here to the argument from ignorance fallacy. The argument from ignorance fallacy is where somebody admits that they don't know, but then goes on to give an explanation anyway. Again, just as a very basic example, it's the person who sees the UFO and says, "Oh my God, I don't know what that is. It must be aliens." Well, no, sorry. The sentence ends when you say, "I don't know what it is." You don't get to say, "Therefore, it is aliens." Right? Now, it's not surprising to me that you attributed this voice to a Christian source. And by your own admission, you were entrenched in the folklore, in the mythology, in the narrative yourself. You were reading it continuously. You were not only reading the Stoics, but you were reading the New Testament. And it's not surprising to me at all that when you had this experience, your brain jumped to an explanation that had at its disposal the archetypes of Christian symbology. You explained this, or your mind at least, jumped to an explanation that used the best tools it had. And those tools were the tools of Christian symbology. Please notice that people in other religions and people who were entrenched in other cultural systems of symbology would have come to conclusions that were similar to yours, albeit with the notable exception of a different theology. So if this had happened to a Muslim, they probably would have explained it with reference to Islamic symbology and imagery and explanations. If this had happened to a Hindu, they might have explained it with reference to the tenets of polytheism or what have you, right? And so, again, I come back to the core point. You're asking me, I mean, it's not a demand of yours, but you said in your opening, or rather at the conclusion of your narrative, that you're interested in how I would explain it. And it might be unsatisfactory to tie a bow in it in this manner, but my response is, I don't know why it happened, but neither does anybody else. And so, unfortunately, while there are naturalistic explanations I can point to, I can talk about temporal lobe epilepsy. I can talk about the capacity for people to have psychological experiences that, as Sigmund Freud would have put it, engage in a kind of psychological form of wish fulfillment. I could talk about the role that drugs may or may not play, albeit I just take it at face value that you weren't under the influence of any narcotics of any description, right? But there are naturalistic explanations that can be offered, but I can't say for sure that any of those apply. And there are religious explanations on offer, and nobody can say for sure that those religious explanations apply. So we're left standing here with an unexplained event, a phenomenon that occurred that we can say no more about other than it happened in your mind. And so if anybody wants to attribute religious agency to it, they're not justified in doing so. And if anybody wants to attribute a naturalistic explanation, they're not justified either. But there is one notable exception here, and it's that every other phenomenon that we have ever discovered has had a naturalistic explanation. Anything we've ever explained has had a naturalistic explanation. And so, using just inductive reasoning in and of itself, I see no reason to suppose why this event would be the first one in history that had a supernatural explanation. I think that the probability on this would lean in the direction of a naturalistic explanation. And that goes back to Hume. And again, I quote, "No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish." In other words, miracle or religious testimony could only be taken seriously if the claim's falsehood were in fact miraculous. There's just not enough verbal testimony to establish the supernatural, or any supernatural claim for that matter.